Welcome to another episode of The Plunge. And we are going to talk about the All-Star Game this episode because we are a few weeks away and it's finalized for March 7th in Atlanta. But before that, we're going to go through some quick hitters. So first of all, Milwaukee Bucks. They have lost 5 straight games as of Friday, and they recently lost to the Toronto Raptors. So they've been struggling, and I think Jrue Holiday not being in the lineup has really kind of hurt their lineup in terms of the ball movement, in terms of their defense even. And yeah, it's just been, it kind of sucks for the Bucks right now, but I think it's too early to hit the panic button at all, just like Giannis said. You're just heading into the All-Star break. You're just kind of dogging your way through it right now, and just kind of, I think the Bucks just need to use this All-Star break to just recuperate and get everyone back. So what are your thoughts about the Bucks?
A healthy Bledsoe is better than no Jrue Holiday at all. So when you look at this Bucks team right now, they've got a gaping hole in that point guard spot defensively and offensively. An interesting storyline to watch moving forward. If you watch their games right now, Giannis is almost being relegated to second option on offense, and maybe that's because he signed the contract and they're not trying to keep him happy anymore, so they're trying to move to an offense that Budenholzer thinks will be more successful moving forward, but not a big deal. They're missing Jrue Holiday, and I think they will improve as the season goes on and become that Bucks team that we know. So Carson Wentz, he found a new home this week in Indianapolis behind a great offensive line with great skill players around him. And Frank Reich, he's been reunited with on this Colts team as well. So I'm excited to see Carson Wentz do great things in Indianapolis. I think he'll return to a top 10 quarterback there. Everyone's talking about, we saw in 2017, we saw him reach MVP levels. I don't expect that. 2018, 2019, Carson Wentz was still a top 12 quarterback in the league. Expect him to return to that with this Colts team.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be Dan Orlovsky and say, Carson Wentz is going to be an MVP again this season coming into the Colts. But I would think that he would, since he's reunited with his old coach, and I think that's going to help a lot. And you got a good offensive line, like you said. T.Y. Hilton's going to be a free agent, so I think if he leaves the Colts, that's going to be a huge loss for him. But I think if he stays healthy, he's going to have a good shot of being one of the better quarterbacks in the league, but not necessarily the MVP. Moving on. The Utah Jazz. So they have won 9 straight currently, and their season high win streak was 11 games, and they just came off of that like a couple weeks ago. So Conley's been out for a while. So what do you think about the Jazz so far in terms of just they just keep steamrolling teams? Do you think they could actually win more than 11 games in a row again this season?
20 for 21. If there is a game for that to end, it would be tonight, because the Clippers, if healthy, will have Paul George. They'll have Kawhi playing again after some rest. This Jazz team consistently puts up great games, with Joe Ingles filling in for Mike Conley seamlessly, Jordan Clarkson coming off the bench scoring 40. Donovan Mitchell, although he hasn't had the greatest shooting year, he's been really effective in being a good teammate and being a superstar who doesn't demand all the attention to be on him, and he can continue to distribute. Derek Favors is ranked 30th in PER right now. Like, there's so much about this team that's going right. If it's going to end, it will end tonight against the Clippers if both Paul George and Kawhi play. But other than that, I don't see this streak ending for a while.
Yeah, they've been just a really good team. And so, speaking of another good team in the Western Conference, we're going to talk about Anthony Davis. And so, our next segment, big deal, small deal, no deal, is Anthony Davis's injury. He's out for 4 weeks, by the way. Is that a big deal, small deal, or no deal to you, Nate?
Small deal, because 4 through 8 in the Western Conference, they're all good teams. So positionally in the playoffs, it won't really matter this year if you're looking at the 1 to 3 seeds for the Lakers. AD is going to be back and healthy, and they will wait for him to be back and healthy. And this is kind of one of those chances that LeBron gets to be the MVP again, because he has all the narrative missing KD, and we're going to go uh, let's say even if they go like a 600 win percentage for the next stretch without KD and LeBron's putting up triple doubles all over the place, expect the media to say that LeBron's the MVP. And when the narrative's with you, it is always going to go that way, even if the statistics point otherwise or if the win totals point otherwise. So this is a small deal to me. I mean, AD will be back. They'll be healthy. They'll be the Lakers by the playoff time.
Yeah, I think it's also a small deal. I'm actually kind of leaning towards no deal, just because, like you said, seeding doesn't really matter. Like if they end up as the 4th or 5th seed, they can just knock out whoever team is on the other side of the bracket. But I'm still in that wake me up until the Lakers in the playoffs kind of mode. Like I don't really care if AD's out now. You still have LeBron, you still have great players in Shooter, Kuzma. They're still gonna win games. There's really not too big of a concern. But the biggest concern for the Lakers is just really getting AD 100% healthy so he can be ready to go 100% coming playoffs time. So next topic, JJ Watt. He's gotten multiple recruitments from the Chiefs and the Titans apparently. And there's just been a lot of news the past few days in terms of who wants JJ Watt, and understandably so. So is this huge recruitment, huge market for JJ Watt a big deal, small deal, or no deal?
Big deal, because JJ Watt's coming from a situation where he had 5 sacks, but sacks in the NFL are really dependent on who else is playing on that defensive line and how much attention they give you, unless you're Aaron Donald, because then getting triple teamed really doesn't matter. You're going to get the quarterback no matter what. But JJ Watt gets into a good situation. I wouldn't say the Titans, because their defensive line is really questionable, and Jadeveon Clowney didn't play well last year. But if he gets into a situation, I like Green Bay with Zadarius Smith on the other side. I like Kansas City a lot with Chris Jones and Frank Clark on that defensive line. Don't even get me started on the Bucs. If the Bucs get JJ Watt, like that is the most dangerous defensive line that I have seen in recent history. If they can re-sign Shaq Barrett, which I imagine is kind of a given at this point. So it is a big deal for whoever signs JJ Watt, because you're moving your defensive line from potentially average to likely great with a signing for him, and he'll have a comeback year after what was just a down year and a down environment for him to play in last year. So big deal for me. JJ Watt's signing is going to go down as one of the better ones for this offseason, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's also a big deal. I mean, it just seems like forever since we've seen JJ Watt really kind of be that top defensive end in the league, and this past year was kind of like a small shadow of that. But you know, he played on the Texans and they didn't really do well in the regular season. So what can you say, right? And so yeah, JJ Watt's 31. He's still got some stuff left him in the tank. So I think whoever gets him is going to be really a really solid. It's got to be a really solid team, and who really wants to make a push for the Super Bowl, because he's at that age where chasing that ring is just first priority for him. So Fernando Tatis in the MLB. He finally signed his contract extension with the San Diego Padres. $340 million for 14 years. Big deal, small deal, or no deal for this?
Big deal. Whenever you sign someone for 14 years, you can be happy with the first 4 years, but the next 10 years, I mean, who can predict what happens? Maybe he gets injured, tears his ACL next year, and never comes back as the same player. So baseball, this no salary cap ordeal that they have going on, where they can offer Mike Trout $500 million, Mookie Betts $400 million, Tatis, he has played 150 games. 150. Like, there's bound to be many guys over a 150 game stretch who have hit 300, who have hit 40 home runs, and then the rest of their careers were bums. I'm not going to say that's going to happen with Tatis, because Tatis he's a generational star in the number one or number 2 position in the baseball field. The center field maybe is more important, but to have a hard-hitting shortstop with a lot of swagger, and he's really brought that San Diego team back to excitement from the fans' perspective, from a national media perspective. a good signing for the first few years, but it's 14 years. Who knows what the world's going to even be like in
Yeah.
14 years? Like, what an insane length of a contract.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to see these like 10 plus year contracts pan out, and you just seen a bunch of them the past couple of years, like Manny Machado, I think, and Garrett Cole, I think, was 8 or 9 years, and Bryce Harper as well, obviously. And when you make these giant contracts, like, yeah, you never know what's gonna happen, and I think, yeah, it is also a big deal for me. Who knows if Tatis is gonna be on the Padres for the entire 10 years or 14 years he's gonna be on his contract. You never know what the Padres are gonna do. You never know what the MLB is gonna be like in the next even 5-6 years, And so, yeah. Moving on, Toronto Raptors. They finally kind of got their groove back, and they got OG Anunoby back from injury. They've won 7 of their last 10 games. Recently against the Bucks, I think twice now the past few days. And yeah, they've seemed to be rolling after a bad 1-6 start. People are criticizing them. So is this a big deal, small deal, or no deal for the Toronto Raptors?
Small deal, because the Raptors are going to be a playoff team in this Eastern Conference. I mean, it's kind of a given, like Atlanta's improved, Charlotte's improved some, but these teams they're not built to win for a whole season. They're built to have good stretches, but they're not built to actually compete for a playoff spot or compete for that kind of 6 through 1 in the Eastern Conference, which is pretty competitive. But Toronto's going to be a playoff team, but this team has plenty of flaws, and these flaws were amplified the night they lost to the Timberwolves, the worst team in the NBA. I mean, Cat barely played, and they beat you with guys like Jared Vanderbilt, and Ricky Rubio had a great game. Like, there are flaws with this Toronto team, and don't let this 7 out of 10 streak make you blind to that. But they're still competitive. I mean, they have Coach of the Year last year and Nick Nurse, and they are going to continue to win games. Fred VanVleet is a borderline all-star player, but this Toronto team is not Toronto of last year. It's not Toronto of 2 years ago. It's not Toronto of 3 years ago for that matter. So, yeah, it seems like a big deal at the time because they're getting back into position, but they're not better than those 5 teams ahead of them.
Here's an interesting stat about the Raptors. They are 14-0 without Kyle Lowry in the lineup. Is that a big deal, small deal, or no deal?
That's a big deal because Fred VanVleet is your future at the point guard position, and clearly he excels when he has the ball in his hands. And Kyle Lowry brings a lot of intangibles, but I've said this time and time again, he will get into the Hall of Fame once his career is done, but that's probably the worst player who's ever going to get into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think the reason that he'll get into the Hall of Fame is that he'll probably lead the league in charges. But yeah, it's weird. Kyle Lowry is just such an interesting basketball player. Okay. We've got all the quick hitters. We got the big deal, no deal, small deal out of the way. Now we're going to get into our main segment, which I'm pretty excited about. We're going to each give our all-star selections. So recently it was the starters were announced, and really there was no surprise. I guess before we get into this, I think Damian Lillard was just snubbed like crazy, but I think I've calmed down from that the past couple of days, just because of a couple of reasons where, okay, sure, you have the entire European continent voting for Luka Doncic. I understand that. And I think people already recognize how good of a player Dame is. And come on, it's just starting for an all-star game. It's not too big of a deal. He's going to play like crazy in the all-star game anyway. It won't really taint his reputation. Everyone knows about his clutch numbers by now. But I could even argue I can even argue for Dame to replace Luka in the starting lineup, but I feel like it's not necessary.
It's interesting. You could have slid Luka up to the small forward potentially and taken Kawhi out of the starting lineup. That is something that was feasible. But I don't see a way in which you leave Luka Doncic, who's currently averaging 29, 9, and 9 on this season, outside, considering, yeah, sure, his team is 13 and 15 now, but how many of those games did they have a whole roster? How many of those games did they have competent players around Luka? Like, they were struggling for so long outside of Luka that I don't put the blame on those losses onto him. And so he's continued to he has a better field goal percentage, he has more rebounds, he has more assists than Dame. I obviously watch more of the Mavs games. I love Luka. It's hard because you're leaving either way you swing it. If you go Steph and Dame, or if you go Steph and Luka, or if you go Luka and Dame, you're leaving one of probably the one guy who's probably in like the top 5 in MVP voting right now.
Yeah.
Any way you turn it, you're leaving one of those out.
Yeah. And I guess my only argument would be that Damian Lillard wins you basketball games, and despite having guys in the lineup or guys out of the lineup, and that's just evident by just looking at their record. But anyways, let's start with the Eastern Conference. So Nate, what are your all-star reserves? So 2 guards, 3 forwards, and 2 wild cards.
Yeah, okay. So for my Eastern Conference reserves, I start with the guards, which the first guard is pretty easy. That's James Harden. Thought he should have started in the Eastern Conference. He's been great since he's gotten to Brooklyn. He's been better than Kyrie, and it's not even close. So he's definitely the number 1 reserve in this conference on the guard side. And then number 2 for the reserves, I'm gonna go with Jaylen Brown. He slides in at that shooting guard with Tatum starting at the small forward, but he's been phenomenal all season. He's scored well. He's rebounded well. He can even play make at times. And he's really been the driving force of Boston, which is surprising to a lot of people who kind of look at Tatum as a top 10 player in the league. And then we slide down to the forwards. I've read a lot about forwards, and I continually see this guy left off the list. That goes to Domantas Sabonis. Like, who is not seeing what he's doing right now? Like, he is essentially Jokic just 2 years ago. Like, people are totally ignoring what he's doing. He's an okay 3-point shooter, and he's super great down low. He has good footwork. He really can create his shot down there, creates for other teammates, rebounds at a very high rate. So Sabonis, middle of the conference, he's been super effective. He definitely deserves a spot on the reserve side. And then this is semi-positional. I mean, he doesn't really play a forward position all the time, but my next selection was Ben Simmons for the forwards. Ben Simmons, I mean, he's defensively, he's a 5-position defender, continues to help that Philly team who's in first place all season. He's worked really well through kind of his growing pains this season. He still can't shoot, but he does everything else on the floor. So Simmons as my second forward and Julius Randle as my third. Been great for the Knicks, surprise team, plays tons of minutes, has brought his assists up like crazy this year, has just been the hub of what New York has done so far this season. And then for my wild cards, the first one, he was snubbed last year, which kind of helped him in my case, but Zach LaVine for the Bulls. The Bulls are a couple games under 500, but they played well so far this season, and they will continue to revolve around LaVine entirely. He's scoring 29 points this season, so he gets a spot on this wild card list. And then last but not least, a guy who I hate to watch, but he puts up amazing stats every night, and that's Trae Young. And his game speaks for itself. I mean, he draws tons of fouls. He shoots terrible shots from 40 feet, but he still puts up 26 and 9.
Wow, interesting list. I only have 2 players that were different from yours. and I had Nikola Vucevic over Ben Simmons and Chris Middleton over Zach LaVine. And it was so hard for me to put it together, this Eastern Conference list. But I think Nikola Vucevic has just I think the reason that I chose him was a little bit biased, just because, come on, you got to feel for the guy. He plays in Orlando. No one really cares about him, but he's averaging like 26 and 11 rebounds and like 3.5 assists or something on a horrible team. And sure, you could say like, oh, it's the Magic, like they don't have anyone, so Vooch just takes all the stats. But he's been such an underrated center in the league for the past like 3 or 4 years, and people just never decide to talk about him. And that, I don't know, I just feel bad for the guy. Yeah, and I guess he has a similar story to Sabonis, where no one really watched this guy play. Yeah. What are your thoughts on Vooch?
Yeah, I really like Vooch. I think I mentioned at the start of the season, Boston would be an ideal destination for Vucevic, just because they can give up the defense on the inside. But Vooch is a very effective player. He's put up great stats, but he's also been an all-star in years past, so that's where I kind of lean to the statistical profile of Zach LaVine, who got snubbed last year, compared to Vucevic, who's got his all-star appearances. So not wrong, but just not my preference this year.
Okay. What makes you think to put Zach LaVine over a guy like Chris Middleton, who's shooting another 50, 40, 90 season?
Okay, Chris Middleton, I love Chris Middleton. Like, I don't know what it is about him playing. I love that he's kind of starting to be the man over Giannis. I find that to be really funny, because he's kind of like, he's taken this backseat to Giannis for so long, and all of a sudden Budenholzer's like, in the fourth quarter, look how many touches Chris Middleton gets versus how many touches Giannis gets. It's really funny. He's had a great year so far. Their recent losing streak lost him an all-star appearance in my eyes, because a team that's 16-13 doesn't deserve 2 all-stars, and obviously Giannis has already won, so he just lost out on it. I had to kind of consider him. It was basically him, LaVine, and Tobias Harris, and Tobias Harris actually deserved it more than Chris Middleton, in my opinion. He honestly deserved it more than Simmons also, but Simmons defensively, he brings such a different identity to the game that people are always going to want to pick him if it's the coaches or whatever. So Tobias Harris ousted Chris Middleton, but they were so similar that I had to leave them both off in order for LaVine to finally get that all-star appearance.
Yeah, I don't know, but the Bucks have a better record than the Bulls. They're 12-15. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, my thing with that is the Bulls don't have an all-star outside, right? And where you can say, okay, Chris Middleton, he's been an all-star for what, the past 2 or 3 years? Something like that. And he isn't having his best season this year. So therefore you can leave him off and not get in trouble of really making the wrong decision, because he knows he's struggled. He knows the team's struggled. So he's one of those that you can cast aside this year.
I see. I think the way we approached our all-star picks are a little bit different. I think I picked mine based on not just this year, but maybe a couple of years past, because I was almost really close to picking Pascal Siakam over, I think, Chris Middleton or Trae Young, just because he started last year in the All-Star game. But, I think given this year, his small dip this year, and even in the playoffs, actually is probably the reason why that I left Siakam out. But yeah, I see a reasoning for Zach LaVine. But here's a couple of other guys that were left off both of our lists: Jeremy Grant, Jason Tatum. And let's just give Jeremy Grant some love here. He's the number one option on the Detroit Pistons. He's one of your favorite players. I really think he deserves an all-star spot, but it's just that there's not enough spots on this team.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about Jason Tatum quick first. Jason Tatum has regressed pretty much everywhere this season. He's taking bad shots. The other game, I can't remember who they were playing, but he had like 8 points. Oh, I think it was against the Wizards. He had like 8 points, and he was just like chucking bricks, like not even close. It's not like he was just slightly off that game. It was like he was chucking bricks, missing layups, and all of a sudden I was watching, I'm like, yeah, sure, you're top 10 in the future, but you're not an all-star this year. Like I think people kind of overlap the idea of your history as a basketball player and if your year is an all-star worthy year, because Jason Tatum's not having an all-star worthy year, but there's a strong likelihood he could still be an all-star this year because of his history and what people think of him or the assumptions that people make of him. So I don't like him as an all-star this year at all, but I think he might end up being one. And then
I think part of it for Tatum, you have to attribute his COVID issues to his poor performance the past few games. So needless to say that, yeah, I think Tatum struggled this year for sure, but I think also has to be part of his COVID problems and how he's saying his fatigue is a bit worse this year. So anyways.
Yeah, it's definitely affecting him, but I mean, what can you do? You just have to look at how players have performed this year despite the circumstances around them. But Jeremy Grant, love Jeremy Grant. Wish I could have put him on the list. He scores effectively. He puts up great steals and blocks. He does a lot for a terrible Detroit team, like just so bad. But they manage to beat good teams sometimes thanks to his kind of mental acuity and the way he steps up to guard LeBron or Giannis. And I love that competitive side of him. Your record is the worst in the league. Your team is the worst in the league. Unfortunately, you don't make the All-Star game by virtue of that.
Yeah. And just a couple more last ones. We don't have to discuss too much on them, but Fred VanVleet, and the two Heat players, Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo. Of course, I think if they had a normal offseason, I think at least one of them would make the All-Star game for sure. But yeah, you got Fred VanVleet who's left out of the conversation, but he's having a very good year. And then, yeah, you have Bam. Even John Collins. Yes, no, I don't know. Gordon Hayward.
Yeah, when I look
all these
at
guys.
Bam and Butler, it's one of those situations where Bam's numbers haven't been quite good enough and they haven't won enough games. And when Butler's in the lineup, they've won enough games and his numbers have been good enough, but he just hasn't played enough. So that cancels both of them out right there. Fred VanVleet, the only player who I left off who I felt really bad about. I mean, we talked about Chris Middleton and Tobias Harris, but VanVleet has led a team who's better than the Bulls to a good record. He's had a strong year. He hasn't been an all-star yet in his career. I felt bad leaving him off. He had some great games this season, but not bad enough to put him ahead of Levine because of Levine's snub last year. I felt kind of obligated to pick him. It was like that Beal of this year
right.
kind of situation, right? And so Fred VanVleet, John Collins, not going to start on it. John Collins hasn't been good enough for the All-Star game this year because of how his team has functioned, not because of his talent, in my opinion. But yeah, not good enough this year.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the Western Conference. I felt like this was a bit easier for me in terms of All-Star selections. So for my team, I took... I think the starting or the guards for the reserves are a bit more obvious. Damian Lillard, Donovan Mitchell in the guard spots. And then for the forward spots, man, it's a bit, I don't know, it seems a bit off this year just because I think AD and Karl Anthony Towns, them not playing as much this year, kind of opens the door for a lot of different players. So I think for the front court, I got Rudy Gobert, Paul George, Brandon Ingram. And then the wild cards, Chris Paul is a lock for me. And then the last spot was so hard for me to decide. It was either between De'Aaron Fox, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Devin Booker. But in the end, I think I'm going to go with De'Aaron Fox. So that's my team.
Yeah, okay, so I had Mitchell and Dame at the guards. That was pretty obvious. Forwards, Paul George, Gobert, Davis, but
Oh,
likelihood is he won't play. So I had Williamson in there. And for my wild cards, Chris Paul again. And DeMar DeRozan, just because the
ah,
Spurs deserve an all star. I'd love to give it to Deontay Murray, but his numbers aren't quite good enough. But I've voiced my dislike of how DeRozan plays on this team, but clearly it's working because the Spurs continue to rack up wins this year. So I had to go with him.
okay, yeah. Let's start with the Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram thing. What what made you pick Williamson over Ingram? I think I know why, but why? How come?
The thing with Brandon Ingram is he can be really efficient, and he's kind of like he's in that Chris Middleton with more shots kind of mold. But Zion has the hype, he has the highlights, he has an overall maybe greater impact on the game where when he's going, like he's been going the past 10 games, and he's just unstoppable inside, and they continue to put up crazy points. Like they lost a few games within this stretch, that's because of poor defense, but Zion puts up so many highlights. His shooting percentage is over 60, and he's averaging like 26, 7, and 3 this year. It's clear that people are trying to crown him the next king of the NBA still. So yeah, he's gonna get his first appearance this year, and I don't think Brandon Ingram's play, although similar, is quite as amplified by the national media. So Zion will probably win out, and I think I saw them as about even. So the edge that the media gives him kind of weighed in for me as well. So that's why I went with him.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the argument that I could make for Brandon Ingram is that he's just more of a multi-dimensional player than Williamson. Even his assist numbers were up a lot this year. I think he had a couple triple doubles already. But just him being able to get the ball and get to his spot. I mean, you can say the same for Zion. Like he can get to his spot in the paint, but the way that Ingram plays and just the greater diversity in his offensive repertoire, I think that gives him an all-star spot. Yeah, like he said, I don't think he's gonna make it just because of the media and how they love Zion. But he won Most Improved, so I think you got to give it a couple of years for him to really kind of get into all-star discussions.
Yeah, the thing with Zion and Ingram, when I'm weighing the two, if I was to pick one to build a team around, I think I would pick Ingram because he's a more versatile piece. Like if you have Zion on your team, you have to build your entire team around his strengths and weaknesses. And so in that aspect, I like Ingram more as a player, but Zion's clearly the favorite for media outlets, for everyone in New Orleans. Like he's a star of the show, and he will be for the next 10 years if he stays in New Orleans.
Yeah. Let's talk about De'Aaron Fox and kind of the last wildcard spot for us. I think how does he stack up against DeRozan, like as an individual player, not like their team success, because obviously the Spurs are better than the Kings right now. But when you look at Fox's numbers, 22 points per game, 3 rebounds, basically 7 assists. And the past few games, I think he's had like over 8 assists, and there's quite a few games where he had over 10 assists. And you can say the same for DeRozan, but when you watch Fox play, I think we discussed this already. He's just almost unguardable. And so how does Fox stack up against DeRozan?
Fox had a stretch in the end of January, start of February, where he was 30 and 10. And that gives him kind of the peak Fox is better than the peak DeRozan in my eyes this year. But Fox he had a small injury, missed a couple of games, came back, hasn't been as good. And it's a short season, right? So those games where you have like 8 points and 6 assists, they work against you because DeRozan has been more consistent, less explosive, more consistent for a team who has a better record. De'Aaron Fox has all-star appearances in his future, but this year he had a few too many games where he was a no-show to give him this spot.
I mean, DeRozan had a few no-show games, but I don't know. I see what you mean. But I think a lot of people will make the case for SGA as well. And even Devin Booker too. I think those two guys we both left out of our all-star selections. And I almost chose SGA and Booker. But I think when you look at the Suns team, people will, when you ask who's really the best player on that team, or who's the most valuable player on that team, and it's got to be Chris Paul. And the way not only he manufactures the offense, but he's able to take over in clutch time in the fourth quarter over Devin Booker at times. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on, Gilgeous-Alexander and Booker being left out of this all-star selection?
It's interesting to me how many people would willingly take Devin Booker this year over Donovan Mitchell as the first backcourt reserves. And it's like Devin Booker has been a disappointment for every game this season except for like the past 4 games. And then people want to crown him because he was so good in the bubble last year. He scored 70 in his second season or whatever. He has not been good this year. He is shot all right. I mean, part of him not being good is acclimating to Chris Paul ran offense. But if you have watched any Suns games this season, you know that Chris Paul is the reason that they've won all these games. And Booker has been a secondary scorer and secondary piece to him really this season. But people still want to go through the history of Devin Booker and how he's so much like Kobe or whatever. And they continue to point the narrative to him. And it's like, how are you putting him above the 22-5 Utah Jazz star? Like, just absurd to me. Devin Booker, not an all-star this year. Chris Paul is. Played almost all their games. He's played super well. And he leads that team to a record in a place where they just haven't even sniffed before this season. And the second player that you mentioned, who is the second player you mentioned?
Shai Gilgeous-Alexander.
SGA, yeah. I love SGA. SGA has done a great job. He's been really efficient this year, actually, and he's played really well within that OKC offense where the options are pretty limited. But no one talks about Oklahoma City. No one even, no nationally televised games are with them except if the Lakers play them sometimes. And there's just no talk about OKC. There's no attention that's going to be given to them throughout this season. And 22, 7, and 5 or whatever he's averaging, something around that area, is not enough to push past the fact that no one even knows what he's done so far this season. So it's good numbers. If they eventually get to that 4th seed next year or something and he's putting up the exact same numbers, yes, he would be an all-star. This year, no one cares. So he's not going to be one. And he hasn't done enough to oust Chris Paul or DeRozan in my mind.
I think we're probably the only 2 people in the universe who can name more than 4 players on that OKC roster. I mean, like they're just a bunch of nobodies, but yet we still find ways to discuss the Thunder. Like, Al Horford. He's literally, we both said he's the father of that team. Like, he's just a guy playing amongst teenagers on that team.
My favorite part about watching Al Horford play is that he refuses to run anywhere nowadays. Like, he will walk everywhere. It's like the equivalent to if you watch any Rockets games. DeMarcus Cousins has not even jogged this season. Like, both of those two just barely move, but somehow Horford is like throwing out like 8 assists a game. He's been averaging over 20 since he came back from his son's birth. And you have guys like Theo Maledon breaking Dame and going down the lane and stuff like that. And like Dort is scoring 20 a game. Like, what? When I watch this team, it feels like, how would you ever win a game when one SGA was out for a while and they were still competitive in every game. Like, how do you win a game nowadays in the modern NBA when your best player is Al Horford? Like, it's absurd to me. It's so funny to watch them. They're just like, they just try so hard that sometimes teams will be like, oh, we'll take a step back for a second, and as soon as the team does that, they're like right back with them in the game.
Yeah, I think the game between the Thunder and the Bucks tonight is probably should have been the primetime game tonight. But Al Horford, the amount of times I watched him get the ball at the end of the shot clock and just hit this turnaround Dirk-like fade and makes the shot is like, it's insane. And also you could add LaMarcus Aldridge to that list of like bigs who just don't move at all.
Yeah, although I was trying to stick to ones who have been somewhat effective this season.
Yeah, I guess so. But yeah, the Thunder are really funny to watch.
Yeah, but the fact that Al Horford gets like 2 blocks and 2 steals a game, I don't know how. Like he's like Kyle Anderson if Kyle Anderson had no tricks to his game. Like he just walks everywhere, and sometimes like people will just put the ball in front of him and he'll grab it.
Oh yeah.
If you get a chance to, if you're super bored one night and you want to just laugh for a while, go and watch Al Horford drop 30 and 10 on a team and not break a sweat.
Oh yeah, for sure. This leads to my last question of the pod. I was thinking of guys who you might not think would be an all-star just because of their portfolio, and they're not really that all-around type of player. And one of those guys was Lou Dort. Do you think Lou Dort will make an all-star game in his career?
It's tough to say because he's the most unique weapon in the league right now who's not really ever talked about, right? Like no one has ever talked about Lou Dort other than the series against the Rockets when he was basically locking up James Harden all series. But his offensive game continues to get better. It will just depend on how good OKC is. Like if they're 1 seed and he's averaging 18 points and locking up, he locked up LeBron James the other night late into that game, and he is giving Dame tons of trouble. If he ever gets, let's put it this way, if Oklahoma City within the next 5 years gets more than 20 games nationally televised in a single season, he will be an all-star. But if that doesn't happen, he will not be an all-star.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because he's one of those guys where he's probably not going to be an all-star, but he has to deserve some sort of recognition just because he's just this one-of-a-kind player who plays defense like no other, who moves his feet without fouling in an era where the refs call anything when your hand touches their shoulder or whatever, right? And so, yeah, I think Lou Dort deserves an all-star just as much as Mike Conley. I think those two guys are probably the 2 guys that you would think would make an all-star game just because of what they do in the court, but probably don't because of their recognition by the media or by just even how their team is doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, if Lou Dort doesn't get the first team all defense this year, that would just be a crime because, man, he's been good. For
sure. Yeah, so that does it for this episode of the pod. I had lots of fun just hashing out our all-star selections. If you have any questions, let us know. And subscribe to our YouTube channel if you listen to our podcast there. And yeah, thanks for listening to the pod. And until next time, we'll see you in the next episode.